I have found in recent years that classes kind of like 50-50 really know what intersectionality is. Like 50% of the students have learned it about it in another class. And then some kind of, what we do, I do this too. Like, well, I think I know what it is. And then somebody tells you, and you're like, okay, yeah, I know. But in addition to looking at intersectionality, we're going to take a look at some of the terms that kind of build up and flesh out the ideas of intersectionality. So the first two terms you're familiar with, prejudice and discrimination, and they operate differently. Prejudice is when we're kind of being jackasses, right? We're being judgy and not very nice. So we're making a lot of assumptions when we don't really know, and that can be incredibly hurtful. Discrimination is action. It's when we actually are unfairly treating people. I would argue the vast majority of us are not discriminatory, but I would argue the vast majority of us struggle with being prejudicial from time to time. I would hope by virtue of taking various classes, especially in sociology, that you learn to catch yourself a little bit more, but I wouldn't say anybody ever ends up being completely immune to not thinking and making assumptions about others that, again, oftentimes aren't terribly kind. When these kinds of behaviors, these prejudicial and discriminatory behaviors, end up on a larger scale, sometimes we use the term systemic, like it's built into the systems itself. The other term, again, I'm guessing you're familiar with, is something that's oppressive. When those treatments, those discriminatory actions go beyond like human interaction and the institutions themselves, education, the medical institution, like can be so discriminatory on such a large scale, can be so prejudicial on such a large scale. And so when you end up with this in a macro level experience, it's considered oppression. So a lot of times the word systemic, like I said, is utilized with it kind of interchangeably. But that's an important aspect to make sure that we've got kind of these micro interactions with our prejudices, but then it can end up on a large, kind of insidious, kind of like it just sinks in to the institutions themselves. So one of the other aspects, kind of a buzzword, right, that has come under some criticism in recent times is the term privilege. And I honestly, I think as we take sociology courses, I feel like this is one of the most important concepts that can come out of it. You're going to be looking at privileges, various privileges, possibly privileges that you didn't even realize were privileges. But once you do an activity this week with them, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, yes, it is. So that's inherent in the definition. You have all of these rights and like opportunities and aspect like resources that you didn't earn. That's by virtue of a identity. And look at that second part of the definition. You don't realize you have it. That obliviousness, like that plays into the experience of privilege. One of my students this semester asked an amazing question that if you start to learn about the privilege, what does that do to the definition? Because the part of the definition is kind of the obliviousness, not realizing you have it, but you're still in an advantage. And that's going to be a question. I don't know. Maybe you have an answer. I don't yet, because that we have these moments where we go, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that. So on the left, you see that image. That's actually a flyer. I think it's from the University of San Francisco. A student group on campus tried to educate people about various privileges. And so these particular flyers hung outside of bathrooms, that if you can navigate a college campus or the wider world, right, a Target, a mall, a movie theater, whatever, a restaurant, and you don't have to worry about a bathroom being available to you because you fit into the binary and a masculine or feminine bathroom works just fine with for you. That's a privilege. And if you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about bathrooms. See how that can kind of work. It's really easy when something's not a problem to you that you don't necessarily like. I don't want to say take it seriously, although that does happen, right? That people, we're going to look at that too, the privilege manifesto, that it's not, oh my gosh, is it really that bad? If you're not the person being oppressed by these prejudicial and discriminatory actions of society, I don't think it's necessarily our place to be like, well, you're experiencing it, but I'm going to tell you from my privilege standpoint that it's not that bad. So trying to dial in, it's being acknowledged that it's uncomfortable when you're like, oh my gosh, look at all these aspects of opportunity that I have that are not granted to others. But then really, really digging in and being reflective for yourself, thinking about where you get your ideas and how can you utilize this to, I mean, it's so cliche, right? But what can you do to start to change, even in these little micro interactions, the ways that the world works around you in relation to these discriminatory, prejudicial treatments of others? When we head into the term intersectionality, that's key in gender. We can't just look at femininity, masculinity, non binary, transgender. We cannot just look at the gendered experience and truly understand it in any meaningful way. Because if we don't layer in age, it is very, very different to be a 78-year-old person who is masculine than it is to be a 28-year-old person who is masculine. It is very different when you layer in identities of sexuality, when you layer in identities of religion, when you layer in other like ethnic and cultural identities, when you layer in socioeconomic status, right? That completely, you can't say that any two people with the same shared gender identity have the same lived experience because all of those other identities are going to intersect. And so intersectionality is a theory that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe in the early 90s. And she looked at it through a legal lens. That's where it originally came from, that somebody was being legally discriminated against in relation to being hired for a job. And the courts took a look at it and said, well, I mean, women are hired, people of your minority identity are hired, but they weren't looking at that intersection of both of them. That the fact that those intersections create, sometimes it creates privilege, sometimes it creates various oppressions, discriminations, and prejudices. At the same time that Kimberly Crenshaw was doing this work and creating the term intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins kind of had a little bit of a different take on it. It's called the Matrix of Domination. And the Matrix of Domination focuses more on kind of the power dynamics in society, which can be really, really important to look at too. The amass, like how you can amass resources, how when we look at diversity and just say, oh, we know, we understand, we appreciate, well, no, there's still an underlying power dynamic. And what are we going to do about that? So Patricia L. Collins' work, The Matrix of Domination, kind of pushes us harder on that aspect of let's take a look and let's critique the societal power that gets created by some intersections of identity. So as I've been saying, and I just said a few of these, this is not exhaustive by any means, but what ends up happening as you have these various intersections. So think about, what is your religious belief system? Some of you are like, don't have one. Absolutely. Some of you are like, my family completely has a religious belief system and I no longer adhere it. My family completely has a religious belief system and that works for me and I find so much meaning and purpose and joy in it. So like think about how that one aspect of your life intersects with others. Think about possibly your social class. Think about possibly your race. Now here is the thing. Somebody who is receiving discriminatory, prejudicial, oppressive treatment in relation to social class, if you're dealing with poverty in our society, you are well aware. It is constantly a nightmarish stressor. It's the people that don't have to deal with the socioeconomic stress that are like, wait, what? Wait, it's the, like, and a lot of times doesn't it get said, well, if it were me, finish that sentence, right? If it were me, I'd get 3 jobs. If it were me. Can we just kind of take a second, right, and think about, this is something that's learned through sociology. Like, and think about too the fact that society doesn't even need to be discriminatory against you because we turn on ourselves. What is wrong with me? What is, why can't I, no matter how hard I work or no matter how much I try? And so if we go back to those critical thinking aspects, fairness. Where does fairness end up in this matrix? But think about if somebody were with ability, that's in reference to some people are able-bodied, some people have intellectual ability, some people struggle with intellectual disabilities. So what is it to be a person that is struggling with some varying kinds of disability, but they're from a middle-class family? That's going to have an intersection that's going to look very, very different because they possibly could get resources to have interventions early on as a kid and to get the things that they need, the medical care possibly that they need. How does age and gender interact? Remember when we talked about beauty? Oh, friends, what is it in our society to be an old lady? Or even, quite honestly, an old man. Like, we don't act like, I mean, yeah, okay, so do we have a few poster people that were like, that's beautiful? But as a society, largely, age, gender, like the intersections of it are really, really, really fascinating and a lot of times kind of hurtful. So hopefully this gives you a lot to think about in relation to your own lived experiences. Okay, last thing I want to share with you, another variation of intersectionality that I just think is beautiful. Gloria Anzaldúa, I hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, uh, was a feminist theorist who incorporated poetry into her writing. As you can see, this is an excerpt from some of her writing. Hopefully, you've been exposed to her work in other classes. But she points out with her term borderlands that there's space that gets created in between identities. She talks about her lived experience as a Chicana woman. She talks about her lived experience as a lesbian. She talks about her experience as a person raised in a devout Catholic family and how those intersections can create trauma. And she, in some ways, has to create a new home for herself. But as you can see with this excerpt, this idea, right, these divisions of identity, she likens it to the space in between countries where borders don't technically exist, depending on the country and what decisions are made as far as putting up borders. They can't be stopped, right? You can't you can't you can't deny a person who they are. You can make it excruciatingly difficult. You can make it terrifying. You can make it dangerous. But you can't truly tear someone apart in its entirety, in their entirety, in their lived experience and the beauty that can come from these in-between spaces. I wish I could do an amazing job of explaining her work. If you haven't gotten a chance to read it and you love sociology as much as all of your teachers do, I would really, really recommend it. But I hope by virtue of this week, which I would argue, like I said, with I think privilege is one of the most important aspects that we can study as we go through various sociology classes like gender. But really, as we've been focusing so much on gendered bodies and gendered stereotypes and all of these different things, let's take a moment this week and think about how does it intersect with our many other identities.